Talofa lava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susana Swiswiki. Coming up, Samoa's Prime Minister defeats the second no-confidence vote. Also,
the U.S. said there was no issue with the Marshall Islands signing the treaty because that does not bring the treaty into force.
the Marshall Islands joins the Treaty of Rarotonga, and New Zealand's Prime Minister urged to rule out joining AUKUS. Samoan Prime Minister Naomi Mataafa has survived a second leadership challenge in as many weeks. Fiame defeated the no-confidence vote by 32 votes against the motion and 19 in favour on Thursday. The leadership challenge failed after the instigator of the motion, Vast Party Chairman Laolele Watia Schmidt, and the Human Rights Protection Party leader Tuilaipa Sailele Malilingawi could not agree on a unified position against Fiame. Grace Vivai followed today's sitting and joins me now.
Talofa lava, Grace. So what happened in Samoa's parliament? What were the scenes like?
Talofa lava, Susana. There was a lot of going back and forth, as we had seen on today's live, with many divided opinions. But what was seen was, out of the two factions, Laolis and Fiame's, they stood firm on their own arguments, and also Tule Epa, who stood firm to support Fiame. Now, 6 MPs were given the chance to speak on the motion today. They were all given about 5 minutes, and the motion was to be discussed for about an hour, but it went over for more than an hour. Questions arose regarding the presence of 6 speakers this time, because last week, as we saw, there were only 5 speakers. The Speaker of the House, Papali'i, clarified that the legislative clerk determined that the 5 representatives included the one who made the motion, which was Laoli, were permitted to speak today. And before the speakers, were chosen to represent the motion, Fiame still argued that the motion is to be discussed and passed by Parliament, and that is no different from last week's motion as well. However, Papali'i made it very clear today that as the Speaker, he decided that the motion would still proceed. The discussions around the motion went on for more than an hour, as we saw, and then they also had a break. And when they did come back for a break, Susana Olo moved a motion to remove the Speaker of the House. The Speaker immediately responded, saying that's none of his business, before ordering their removal, which was Olo and also Liatinu'u from the chamber. Both ministers were also then called back later in to cast their votes on the motion of no confidence. The results from today, Susana, came to 32 members of Parliament opposing the motion and 19 for it. The numbers indicated that 51 members voted and 1 MP was also absent, and the Speaker of the House did not vote.
What was the reaction from Laoli when the motion was defeated?
Yes, good question. After the motion passed, Laoli got up to speak. He seemed quite calm, but also looked gutted. He showed good sportsmanship by thanking the Speaker of the House. He said, whatever outcome has come out from today, may they look forward now. And he asked, for forgiveness from those who watched today's live, as well as Parliament and also the Speaker of the House.
And what happens next?
Yes, so Fiame spoke at the end, asking the Speaker of the House for a 2-week break due to the recent intense events. However, the Speaker of the House said that tomorrow's meeting will still go ahead, and then the parliamentary committee meeting can meet afterwards. He says that it's a short day tomorrow and should finish around 12 p.m., especially with the many bills that are yet to be passed, including the 10% of seats for female representatives, and also Samoa's budget coming up in June, July.
The South Pacific Nuclear-Free Treaty signed by the Marshall Islands still needs to be ratified to come into force. The agreement was signed in Machuro during the observance of Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day. Our Marshall Islands correspondent, Giff Johnson, says the island nation could be seen to be in breach of the spirit of the treaty with the ongoing presence of the US military.
A lot of people just assumed that the reason that the 3 compact countries in the North Pacific didn't sign on is because of the US security and defense relations being a conflict with the treaty. And as it stands now, the Marshall Islands is the first of the 3 North Pacific countries that are in free association with the United States to sign up on the treaty.
And I'm surprised that the Marshall Islands have signed, and I was one of the people who thought there was a conflict with the Nuclear Free Treaty and the Compact of Free Association. So is there no conflict then?
The signing of the agreement was done in consultation with the United States government, okay? And the acting foreign minister who signed, David Paul, told me that they consulted with the U.S. ambassador and the U.S. government, and that the U.S. said there was no issue with the Marshall Islands signing the agreement, the treaty, because that does not bring the treaty into force. That's the first step. The country has to sign, and then it has to go through its own constitutional process of ratification. And in the Marshall Islands, that requires a resolution to be introduced to the Nidijala or the parliament, and then parliamentary approval before the country actually accedes to the treaty. So this is the initial step indicating that the country supports the treaty, but it hasn't actually ratified it. And so what the acting foreign minister said to me is that the Marshall Islands and U.S. governments, like I assume verbally agreed that they would further discuss a memorandum of agreement to spell out the details of U.S. defense and security requirements to ensure that there was not a conflict, right? And so that before the Marshall Islands moves to introduce a resolution into the parliament for approval, some discussion has to go on with the U.S. government. That implies a recognition that there is a conflict, potentially, and they need to work it out how the U.S. would deliver its defense and security requirements, principally at the Kwajalein Missile Range or the Reagan test site, where weapon systems are tested routinely, and how that might, like how they're going to work that out.
We saw with AUKUS, there was that big discussion about Australia's nuclear submarines not holding actual nuclear weapons, but being nuclear powered, and a discussion if that went against the treaty. And there was a lot of discussion on both sides. I feel like the general consensus that I heard was it potentially just goes against the spirit of the treaty, not against the actual rules specifically. Do you think that could also be a problem for the Marshall Islands in regards to nuclear submarines or other nuclear powered military vessels?
At the present time, and for decades during the Compact of Free Association period since 1986, the U.S. government, the U.S. military has routinely brought naval vessels, Coast Guard vessels, and various other vessels, airplanes, and so on into the Marshall Islands, right? Whether for support activities or transiting and refueling or whatever they're doing. And essentially, the U.S. policy is it neither confirms nor denies the presence of nuclear weapons on board aircraft or vessels, or whether they're nuclear powered, right? And the decades of the relationship, I have never heard anybody in the Marshall Islands government raise that issue, right? Like, is it a concern? Because according to the compact, which is a defense and security agreement at its essence, the U.S. is allowed to carry out its responsibility, which is very clearly spelled out to defend and provide defense for the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. So yes, I think you could fairly easily make the case that the activity at Kwajalein, the compact's defense provisions, do run afoul of the spirit of a nuclear-free treaty, whether they in fact run afoul of the legal language, the letter of the law may be another point.
New Zealand's Green Party is calling on the Prime Minister to rule out joining the AUKUS military pact following a heated meeting between US President Trump and Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky. Green MP Tia Nautsoyono, who's also the party's foreign affairs spokesperson, said Trump's hyper-aggressive foreign policy makes the case to stay out of AUKUS stronger than ever, adding that it's escalating tensions in the Pacific region. I spoke to geopolitical analyst Jeffrey Miller and began by asking him if the concerns are valid.
Look, there are a real range of views on AUKUS. It's been at the centre of a debate on New Zealand foreign policy for 2 years now, and it's not going away anytime soon. I think Christopher Luxon's approach at the moment is very much to play for time and very much say that New Zealand is still exploring, considering, looking at all of these things. In the end, it's all out of Christopher Luxon's hands, really, because we have a new president in town, Donald Trump, and he does take a very different view of the world to his predecessor, Joe Biden. So to some extent, I think the debate on AUKUS is perhaps slightly premature. We still really lack a steer as to what Donald Trump's view on AUKUS actually is. And remember, we've seen the way that he has treated Canada and Mexico, for example, in the last 6 weeks. So there's no guarantee even that Donald Trump will want to continue AUKUS in the present form with Australia, one of the core members, let alone bring in smaller players like New Zealand into what is called Pillar 2.
What do you think the relationship would be like between New Zealand and the Pacific if New Zealand were to join AUKUS as an associate member?
I think it would complicate New Zealand's relationship with Pacific states because of the nuclear aspect, if it were to happen. And again, I do think it is quite a hypothetical at this point, not to sound too much like a politician myself. But remember, we do have the nuclear-free zone and we have the Treaty of Rarotonga. The view of the AUKUS members is that these are nuclear-powered submarines. They are not nuclear weapons, and therefore they are all compliant with the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Remember, Australia doesn't have nuclear weapons, so this would be a transfer to a non-nuclear weapons state of nuclear material inside these submarines. Remember, it's highly enriched uranium in these submarines. In theory, you could take that out and use it for nuclear weapons. You could repurpose it. Strictly speaking, it is compliant with the letter of the regulations. There's a loophole effectively under the NPT, as it's called, but I don't think it's a great precedent to set. Now, when it comes to New Zealand's position, the view is that AUKUS Pillar 2 does not involve the submarines and therefore is not nuclear related, and that is important for New Zealand's domestic audience as well, and that messaging has been made repeatedly over the past couple of years, that AUKUS Pillar 2 is completely separate from AUKUS Pillar 1. I'm not sure really if that's the case. I think AUKUS Pillar 2 to a degree is very much linked with AUKUS Pillar 1. They are two halves of this same coin in effect. Otherwise, why would you link the two in the first place? So if you're in the Pacific, in the end, you're probably not going to be that happy with a project that is about legitimizing nuclear materials of any description, whether they're in submarines or out of submarines. So I think that's the complexity there, and it would have a big impact on New Zealand domestically as well because of the strong nuclear-free identity that many New Zealanders have become accustomed to since the 1980s. Remember, 40 years of that nuclear-free identity.
Now, you just mentioned the Treaty of Rarotonga, and we've just seen the Marshall Islands become the latest signatory. Does this treaty hold any weight to ward off the nuclear-powered submarines from AUKUS if they were to ever enter the Pacific region?
I'm not sure on that, whether that directly has an impact. I would rather suspect that depends on who you ask, and I think the view would be for, if you're Australia or the United States, is that you will transit through international waters if you wish to. Remember, these nuclear-powered submarines are being constructed for one reason, and that is that they can head up to the Taiwan Strait without needing to refuel, and they can head back again. That, in the end, is what AUKUS is all about, and it is a project that is squarely aimed at China. That's why China has reacted so vociferously to the construction of these submarines. But of course, to get to other parts of the world, you have to transit through places like the Pacific, and the Pacific, of course, is so vast. It is going to end up being a transit point at various times. So it does involve others. It would be good to see some transparency about all of this, but the nature of submarines and AUKUS as a whole is that it is being dealt with to some degree in behind closed doors. And we're not privy perhaps to a lot of the twists and turns into how this is all being developed. I'm absolutely certain that there is more than we've been told about New Zealand's involvement in AUKUS Pillar 2 as well, and what is being planned. I think if Kamala Harris had been elected US president, possibly New Zealand would have already been included in AUKUS Pillar 2 by now. But we've got now a very different president in the White House with a very different view, and I think that it is what is perhaps what is delaying some of these final decisions about what goes on with AUKUS in particular with regards to Pillar 2. But as I say, even AUKUS Pillar 1, the nuclear powered submarines, I think it's a bit up in the air. Remember, Donald Trump has an America first foreign policy. He is not necessarily an alliance president at all. He's an alliance president when it is in the United States interest, when it is in US national interest. That's when countries like Australia or Canada fit in. And if there's not a direct benefit for the United States, then we've seen Donald Trump is quite willing to tear up relationships, really, or we've seen that with Canada and the tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed, for example, even very close allies. So that's the context that we're dealing with at the moment.
Do you think there are any benefits that the Pacific could gain from AUKUS, or is this just purely something to counter China's influence in the region?
Well, again, that's very much dependent on who you ask. I think if you talk to Australian, US policymakers, they would see this as a benefit for regional security. I think Christopher Luxon himself, the New Zealand Prime Minister, described it as a good thing for regional security. And if you take the view that China is the big threat here, having nuclear powered submarines patrolling the Pacific might be a benefit. I tend to take the view that this is escalation and we don't need more escalation. It's already a pretty dangerous world out there, and it seems to be only becoming more complex by the day when you look at what's happening in the Middle East or Ukraine, elsewhere. When you look at what's happening in New Zealand's own region as well in the Pacific, I don't think nuclear-powered submarines, I don't think adding those to the picture actually makes us better off. I take the view that escalation begets more escalation, and I would prefer to have a strategy that's focused more on de-escalation, diplomacy, dialogue. I think this is where a state like New Zealand, as a small state, can fit in best. And I think it's where many Pacific states probably fit more comfortably in. In the end, small states don't have huge capabilities. They don't tend to have huge militaries, huge armies, huge navies, and they do fit in quite nicely into more dialogue-focused approaches, particularly New Zealand with its independent foreign policy. Remember, the United States suspended its obligations to New Zealand under the ANZUS treaty back in the 1980s. So New Zealand is not a formal US ally. So AUKUS would be a big shake-up to all of that in many ways. As I say, there will be different views on whether AUKUS is a benefit or a disadvantage to the Pacific overall. I tend to take the view that it's another example of escalation in these geopolitical tensions between Western countries and China in this case, and we'd be better to avoid that. There will be others who have different views.
That's Pacific Waves for today. For all episodes, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, tō whā sui fua.